several alternative legal bases on which to carry out your processing of personal data. You are required, of course, under the EU data protection regulations to have a recognized legal basis for your processing. One of the most important such legal bases is consent, where you have the data subject's consent to the processing. Now, this has been amended or reviewed under the GDPR. Insofar as your organization's processing is based on consent, you would need to review if this consent still fulfills the requirements on GDPR. One good example, for example, of a change in the new regime is that under the present common practice, at least, is that organization will collect consent from data subjects within the course of entering into some kind of agreement or getting having a dialogue or communication with the data subject and discussing terms and conditions. And one paragraph might deal with consent in that context. Now, the GDPR has set a requirement that any collection of gathering consent within this kind of dialogue has to be clearly distinguishable from the other terms and conditions being discussed with the data subject. So this, one common practice evolving is to have a separate, explicit sort of tick box, for example, where the data subject makes some kind of mark or otherwise makes sure to express the consent in a form that can be documented and stored. And that is really to be recommended. But at the very least, you have to be able to show that you have been presenting the consent process in an unmistakably distinguished manner. As has already been the case before, consent continues to have to be informed, but the GDPR makes it more clear by explicitly stating that the information about the processing being carried out, which lies as the basis for getting the consent, this information has to be easy to understand and presented in a form that the data subject can actually relate to. It has to be pedagogical. And this has also been, to my mind, a long-established, less than perfect practice by many business organizations, that the information about the processing presented to the data subject has been set in terms quite difficult to grasp for an average data subject. And this has never been a good practice, and now it is will clearly not comply with the requirements of the GDPR. So really, most organizations are advised to review the form of information they present, how the content has been set out, and if they actually fulfill the requirement of being easy to understand. One further new aspect to consent is when dealing with minors or underage people who are not of regular, so normal age to enter into normal contracts or have the full rights of an adult. The GDPR has set a explicit bar of the age 16 where organizations may rely on these individuals' consent, at least as regards information society services online, services provided online. Here again, the EU and the GDPR has left a level of dependence for individual member states to set another age limit as far as not going below the age of 13 for information society services. So those companies providing services in the EU to underage people will still, and especially if you want to provide them to someone who's younger than 16, you will need to do a country by country survey. Finally, one interesting matter where the regulation in GDPR about consent interacts with other regulations is when it comes to the use of cookies. We have today the e-privacy directive, the European Union part of the European Union Electronic Communications Code that is now being rewritten and merged into a unified code. But outside of the Electronic Communications Code, we will probably have an e-privacy regulation that is now being negotiated between the legislative bodies. It remains to see exactly what it will look like, but it seems very likely that the present, or we can count on that the present regulations of requiring consent to cookies, and this means that you can't rely on other possible legal bases, such as the weighing of interest. To set a cookie, you have to provide informed consent. Now, this has been quite a matter of discussion within the member states on how this consent should be gathered. We have a range of levels of stringency here, where some jurisdictions, as we will hear from the Netherlands, have set quite a high bar on how someone who places a cookie can be able to demonstrate they have a consent. In other jurisdictions, such as where I work in Sweden, there are a recent recommendation from the supervisory authority that web browser settings will be sufficient. This is again under the present regime, so we'll see what happens with both the privacy regulation and of course the GDPR comes into force. I know this is a matter that Marta has experience of from the Netherlands, so we'd like to, if I may pass over the microphone to you, you could tell us about how you've been working with tracking cookies, particularly in the Netherlands.
Of course, insofar as you are interested, but the Netherlands knows the Telecommunications Act, which requires for cookie placing that you have consent and that you inform the web users of the placing of cookies. And for the definition of the term consent in the Telecommunications Act, it actually refers to the Data Protection Act that currently exists. And the current Data Protection Act allows implied consent. So as far as we're concerned, until May 2018, implied consent will be okay as far as cookies go. But once the GDPR enters into force, of course, implied consent will no longer be sufficient. You will have to have explicit consent. And as long as the Telecommunications Act refers to the Data Protection Act or the GDPR insofar as the definition of the term of consent goes, the consent will also have to be explicit. But of course, that is until the e-privacy regulation enters into force, and then things might change by then. But this means that you will no longer be allowed to use an opt-out option, and you will have to use an opt-in option. And consent is your basis when using tracking cookies. But in most cases, for example, if you have a web shop offering products to the European Union member states, your legal basis for processing that data will most likely be the execution of a contract and not consent. So in my opinion, consent is kind of overrated in so far that most companies think that as long as they have consent that they are okay. But it's important to realize that consent can also be withdrawn at any time and that you will no longer have a basis for processing the data.